less than 3% of clinical professionals are Black. And that's not to say that because you're Black, you're automatically culturally competent, but we do know for a fact that that's a starting point for a lot of Black people. It's like, look, if I'm gonna talk to somebody, the proxy is that if they're Black, then they understand me, right? And we can get deeper, further, faster. Also, too, therapy is expensive, right? Like in a lot of situations, therapy can be a luxury. Like who has the funds and to pay for like $150, $200 session every time? And then you start to get into other issues around like, if we talk about food deserts, right?
Right.
I'm sure there's a lot of health and wellness deserts out there too.
What up?
What up? What's
Good
up?
to see you.
Good to see you, man.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, we're calling this soul training. And when I think of soul training, one of the words that always comes to my mind is alchemy, you know? Because the way I think of the soul is something that's internal and it's always moving and there's this transformational process. And I know that you feel a connection to this idea of alchemy. So what is alchemy to you?
It's my life, it's my livelihood, it's how I think, it's how I move, to your point. So much so that I named my business after it. Specifically, like Alchemy talks about the transformative process from turning lead to gold. And the way that I thought about it was like, look, I'm always evolving. And the way that I pulled that into the naming of my company was like, look, as it relates to health and wellness, it's always like a moving picture for us. From the day that we're born until the day that we pass away, we have like need states. And those need states vary as we move across the time spectrum. And what I saw out in the marketplace was that nobody was focused on the Black community's health and wellness need states across the time spectrum. And this transformative process of saying like, look, our community right now is at an outsized risk for every chronic disease and illness in the book. That's lead. How about I take a company and prioritize with a mission to create generational health and take those stats and make them gold.
And how much of your own personal experience really motivated the vision?
You know, my experience directly was when I retired from the NFL. I was dealing with depression, anxiety, identity issues, just trying to figure out who and what I was when I wasn't tackling somebody. And during that time, and this is like 2015 for like time reference, I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help myself. And in that moment, I realized that I couldn't even buy help because I didn't even know what I was looking for. And also during this time too, my family was going through a laundry list of chronic conditions. My grandmother had a stroke. My father-in-law passed away at an early age from a heart attack. My grandfather passed away from Alzheimer's and dementia. My uncle had a type 2 diabetes amputation. All these things were happening. And I'm like, again, I just asked one simple question. I'm like, who's doing something about it? And so, you know, that's how I got into the seed of like actually doing something about it.
Yeah, you mentioned depression, and I know a lot of the guys I played with when they left the league, all these things kind of caught up with them.
Yeah.
You know, when they started to catch up with me, I realized that a long time ago when I started playing sports, playing football, it was a way to escape or get away from all of these heavier issues. Mm-hmm. And for me, the specific heavy issue was being an African-American male in this country.
Yeah.
And I found that if I could perform on the field, you know, it took at least some of those stressors and kind of put them off to the side. But when I was done playing, you know, I was just another Black male.
Yeah.
And the depression and all, even when I was playing and I would start to think about that, my mortality, you know, what do I have if I don't have all of this?
Did that make you sad?
At first it scared me, but after I got over the fear, I started realizing that I could do something about it. And so I started asking myself, like, it doesn't have to go that way, you know, and I was still young enough that I realized I could do something about it. That's when I walked away and started to explore things other than just being a football player. And I felt like it was by far the best decision in my life because I felt like so much of me I had to like put aside in order to fit the role of what I thought I was supposed to be as a football player. And when I finally gave that up, I felt like this huge weight was off my shoulders and I had permission to be more, even more than what I was as a football player. But that idea, it didn't occur to me until I was in it. Because so many people, they have dreams, and the dreams are always something that are so far away, and because they don't ever put the work in to accomplish the dream, they always have that sense of chasing the dream. But for us, and you said it earlier, a lot of us accomplish our dreams in our early 20s. And I know for me, when I did it, there was no question about what's next. It took me years of suffering of this ain't it until I finally said what's next. But I think a lot of guys don't have that experience until nobody wants them anymore.
That's when the music stops.
Yeah.
And I think you had mentioned just like the mortality or the finality of the situation. You spend so much time, effort, energy, resources. Again, we talked about like getting to the destination, and then you realize even when you get to the destination, you still got to keep going. Right. And even once the time in that area of destination, there's life beyond that, and we're so focused on that stop that we don't even know what life looks like beyond that. And that's what happened to me. And I was a guy who thought like, Mike Tomlin said to me my rookie year, he was like, football it's not who you are, it's what you do. And I thought I knew what it meant, but I didn't have the lived experience to actually put it into practice. And so during my time in the NFL, like I kept that in mind, and I was trying to like still prepare myself via some programming. Shoot, I even got an MBA when I was an active NFL athlete. I was like, that is not going to be me.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be a statistic, divorce, drug abuse, whatever it is, bankruptcy, not going to be me, right? And I thought that by preparing myself through education and degrees and stuff like that would help. It helped a little bit, but the real work needed to be done on the inside, right? Of like, who am I? What is my inner being like? What does that self-love practice look like for me? That emotional intelligence, I was severely lacking, and that was when we talk about like that finality and in that moment, that's where I think a lot of our peers, find themselves.
Yeah. I remember the moment before I finally reached out and asked for help. I was young. It was my second year in the league, and I caught myself complaining about all the people in my life. And then I was done, and I started to do the math, and I realized the common denominator was me. You know? And there was this moment where I had an opportunity to look in the mirror. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but to see a monster. And when I say monster, a part of myself that I hadn't even given the opportunity to develop, and that I was seeing the result of that in my life. Yeah. On the football field, the monster had free reign to be able to go and do its thing, but off the field, there was inner work that I needed to do.
How do you feel when you look in the mirror?
I feel like I'm looking at wisdom. At wisdom.
What did that feel like pre all the work that you've done?
I didn't want to look in the mirror. I'd avoid it.
It's interesting too, because you talked about what led to you starting your company and realizing there was all these inequalities in access to healthcare. But you started it, the way I understand it, with this pillar, like at the foundation of mental health, which in the Black community it's a pretty big design, right? Like it's a whole thing you're taking on. You're taking on the stigma there, all those things. Is it so much just because of your own journey that it was impossible for you not to see how powerful and important that was to put it at the center, or what made you choose putting it at the center of this whole company that you're building?
Yeah, I just really got to the fundamental belief that a healthy life starts with a healthy mind. And I was a living, breathing example of the destination not being, I don't want to use the word sufficient, but it doesn't bring you peace, joy, or fulfillment. And so one could look at a NFL athlete such as ourselves, and say, like, you made it, you should be okay, you should be fine, your life should be great and grand. But we know that that is not the case. And I found out, and I mentioned earlier, like, I couldn't even buy my way to help. So I'm like, look, if I'm going through what I'm going through, then geez, like, what does it look like for folks who don't have the life situation that I have? And I saw trends in the marketplace where we talk about accessibility. Like, healthcare is really becoming verticalized now. Like, there's platforms for men, there's platforms for women, there's platforms for the LGBTQ community, so on and so forth. But there's not a platform that was principally focused on folks who look like you and I. And I was like, well, that's a problem, right? Because I'm going through what I'm going through, my family's going through what they're going through, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other people are going through it too, but nobody's doing anything about it. And I see all this money flowing here, this money flowing there, so on and so forth. So it's not because of lack of money, and it's not because of lack of, like, just available technology or platforms, just nobody's operating with the intentionality to really go at it. Less than 3% of clinical professionals are Black. So there's a huge just disconnect starting out with that. And that's not to say that because you're Black, you're automatically culturally competent, but we do know for a fact that that's a starting point for a lot of Black people. Is like, look, if I'm gonna talk to somebody, the proxy is that if they're Black, then they understand me, right? And we can get deeper, further, faster. But there's such a, quote, supply shortage of even available therapists that it's not meeting the rising demand. Also, too, therapy is expensive, right? Like, in a lot of situations, therapy can be a luxury. Like, who has the funds and to pay for like $150, $200 session every time? That's a tough swing. And then you start to get into other issues around, like, just geography. Can you get to them? Are they in the, if we talk about food deserts, right?
Right.
I'm sure there's a lot of health and wellness deserts out there too, right? But we don't talk about that too much, right? So geography is an accessibility, like, quite literally, accessibility is a huge issue. And then you already layer in the stigma and the lack of just, like, knowing what to even look for. It becomes such a daunting task to, quote, see a therapist. But that's what everybody says, go see a therapist. That is incredibly hard to do. You don't know what you're looking for.
Right.
It costs a lot of money. Like, it's just a highly inefficient process.
I think even culturally, how we define health is different. In my understanding of the growth of psychology in this country, psychology really started to go on the rise when religion started to go down. And so I think, at least my experience of being healthy, growing up in the church, is having some, like, greater purpose than it just being about me. So I see psychology is still very young. And I think these kinds of conversations, and when cultures come together and start to have conversations about how we define health, I think it becomes more inclusive, because I've been through lots of psychotherapy and, different therapists, male, female, Caucasian, like, across the board. And where I felt there was a vacuum is that they were dealing with my psychology, but I felt there was something deeper in me that wasn't being acknowledged. And I think about what you said about Mike Tomlin, and just that situation. I never got to play for an African American coach, but that situation, and a lot of players that have played for the Steelers kind of say the same thing, this idea of being seen, somebody seeing something connected inside. Exactly. Yeah. Whereas I feel like some coaches, they look at us like chess pieces. They sometimes they don't see that there's, like, a soul, there's something, a character, there's something deep inside that needs to be engaged if this is going to be a meaningful experience for all of us.
Yeah. I mentioned that, I've really been tapping into this book, The Power of Now, and it literally talks about that through the lens of, like, our being. We all have, like, an inner being, and that inner being you can't put a value on it, right? But a lot of times we equate our life situations with our life. Those are two separate things, right? Situations change. I could have a lot of money, a little bit of money, so on and so forth. Situations change, but your life and the quality and the value of your life remains consistent. And so a lot of times, and I'm probably still guilty of this, and it's like a practice that you just have to maintain, but always just trying to make sure that I'm not attaching my self-worth to how much money I'm making, and outcomes, like all these things externally change. But just making sure that I'm grounded in who I am, and again, applying that self-love and self-worth internally, regardless of how things work out on the outside.
This culture sets us up in a way to, a lot of the things we're talking about here are countercultural practices in many ways. How do you set yourself up in ways to achieve that end goal of not attaching your worth to the outcome?
Be wherever my feet are. Like if I'm here, then I'm engaging with this conversation, not letting the worry or fear of what may or may not happen in the future affect how I feel right now. And conversely, not letting what happened in the past affect me right now. There's nothing that I could do about that. That's happened. And now you mentioned something really important around, like, I have the power to change it.
Yeah.
I could change it,
yeah.
right? But a lot of times we just don't tap into our own personal power to change things.
Yeah.
We just think that we have to resign to our situations. A lot of times, more times than not, we have the power to either change the situation, or we have the power to change how we show up or feel in that situation.
And I think they're not actually separate, because when we own the power to show up in the situation changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think you said it I studied yoga, meditation, all this stuff, but all of it comes back to the same thing, and it's watching your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that I found is the mind is the most powerful creative force that we have. And I think the teaching or the training to be in the present moment is because when the thoughts are going back to the past,
mm-hmm.
first thing they're going to things that we don't have the ability to control. Mm-hmm. The thoughts are always there, and we can decide, if we grab them and get taken down the street with them, or if we realize this thought actually isn't producing anything constructive.
Yep.
And what thoughts, how can I think, how can I feel that's gonna create something that actually feels good to me?
Yeah.
That sense of agency, like choice, like you guys are talking about, is so powerful. There are a lot of marginalized people that don't feel like they have agency. So
mm-hmm.
how do we start that process more than just telling them that they do? Like, what is the process to get marginalized people engaged in having the agency in the processes you're talking about?
Having a conversation and building like a community around it. A lot of times that we think that we have to embark on this journey by ourselves. The work, yes, in practice, in theory, the journey inward is one in which you have to take, but you don't have to go through it in isolation. And I think we talked about it, in the back, but like behind the curtain, everybody's working on something. And if we could all, and particularly over the last 3 years, man, like if you ain't been through, COVID, shelter in place, all these other things, like I think there was like a soul awakening, I guess. And
yeah.
I think we can now come to the table in a more vulnerable and frank manner. So like community is really, really big for me, and understanding that like you're not alone, and like how can you like work with community, family, etc., to like destigmatize a conversation, build up the language and the resources on an internal perspective to start to shape and reshape how you think about your situations that are around you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going big with this one. I think it requires a paradigm shift. When I was talking about the myth, is like we've all inherited an old mythology about how things are supposed to be. And I think even when we try our hardest to try to figure it out, if we're still stuck in the myth, it doesn't really change. And I think it really is about like revisioning what it means to be human. I think so much of what I see is a response to hopelessness. Even the idea of it's a journey, 100% it's a journey. But I think one of the reasons I think people get stuck with this idea of the journey is because they don't believe that there is a destination. And I think sometimes we will say, becoming your best self, but even becoming your best self, for what reason? And you're a great example, Ryan, of when we truly find something, when we find the elixir, we know we found it because we have this passion to share it with other people.
That's the purpose, that's the meaning, all of it.
A lot of guys, particularly in football and even just in sports, a lot of athletes are a lot more vocal about it, like Michael Phelps, Naomi Osaka, so on and so forth. But specifically as it relates to football, a lot of guys just hit me up. And just like I saw you back then, like people still probably see you now, they see me now, like, and they're like, yeah, can I talk to you? Or like, can you make a recommendation? Do you have?
What's that like for you? Yeah.
It's a whole lot of responsibility because people are coming to me, and I think I don't know if this is like self-imposed, but they think I have everything figured out. And I'm more so saying that I'm being very vulnerable about my experience, and I'm willing to take the necessary steps to like help pave ways and help other people figure it out as I figure it out. Not I have it figured out, now I'm going to go back and help you figure it out. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we could figure it out together. And so it's a lot of responsibility, but honestly, it's very humbling. And I take that very, very seriously. Because even when we talk about like our past, like I was already a player rep with the union, so I always really kind of cared about like player safety, health and wellness, championing like life outside of the lines for athletes. But now it's just escalated to a whole new level.
So when you say figuring it out, like what does that mean to you?
Finding out what I already am. I believe that everything that we could possibly need, want, and will eventually be is already within us.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Think of it as like a seed, It's like you have apple seeds, that you're gonna get an apple tree, but you have to give it the right nutrients and the right environment for it to express fully.
Yeah.
And I think of like soul training. That training of the soul is to allow what is inside of us to actually express through us.
Where are you at on that journey?
I feel I'm there.
So you're on purpose now?
I feel like I'm on purpose. And it's almost startling. I think, because at least for me, I didn't have a lot of role models of people that were living their life on purpose. And so as I stepped into it, I almost felt like self-conscious. Like, is it okay to feel this on fire and this passionate and this clear about where I'm headed?
Or even, are you doing it right?
Yeah.
Is this the right way to do it? Because if you don't necessarily have like a role model, it's like, am I doing this right? I always ask myself that.
Yeah.
Like, even running a business, like, I never had a corporate job. I'm learning everything as I go. And that self-doubt around like, man, I don't know if I'm doing this right. And it's particularly hard sometimes in life because in sport you have immediate feedback loops. And a lot of times, once you escalate up the career trajectory, those feedback loops are just like very intuitive. Like, oh man, I missed a step here, or I missed a read. Like, okay, got it, can do it next. Like in business, I don't know if it's gonna work for a month, 2 months, maybe ever. Life, not sure, right? And then on top of that, like we don't have the visual cue to understand and go back and like rewind the tape.
Yeah.
And I'm always trying to figure out now, like, how do I apply a lot of the things that create like this great internal persona.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. The heart and mind of an athlete, how do you translate that into actual life?
It's tricky because I think there's a right, but I think that right is something that's unique and specific to each of us, And sometimes we get seduced into thinking the right exists out there. Mm-hmm. Life happens for us, not to us. To me, it resonates like to football because when you're in it, sometimes you don't realize it. But to take a step back and to realize the process of what occurs in a successful season, okay, is the team gets better. Mm-hmm. It's like after we played the Patriots, or the Steelers, because we had to prepare for that crosstalk. But anyway, after we played them, whoever we had next was in trouble because we had to be on our P's and Q's to prepare for that challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember the moment of my lowest point after I retired and I was starting to let everything people were saying get on me, that I ruined my life. I threw it away. And I had this flash from any movie, right? There's always a point in the movie where the protagonist is like in it, and I realized I'm at that point. But in the movie, right, he always figures it out. And I was able to draw strength from this idea of this is not is not happening for like some negative reason. It's happening for me to respond. And the end result is 100% determined by how I respond.
Tell me about that moment when you figured it out. Is it like, are you like here, and then you just figured it out there, or is it like?
It's like here, and then like you stew in it for a little bit, you know? And I have like a certain tolerance, is I can only be in that place for like 2.5 days. And then like something happens or I start to get creative, like, okay, right? Instead of focusing on what I can't do, I started considering what can I do? And even just that, if it's just a little sliver about something I can do and I take that step, it shifts the momentum.
Yeah, the reason why I ask is sometimes I find myself like manufacturing adversity to like kind of feel like I need to rise to the occasion, right? Like things need to be this close, right, for it to like actually kind of turn around.
And I wonder too how much of that is just the athlete, you know, in you too, that
I think that's where it comes from.
That conditioning of that, right?
Yeah.
Everything had to be that big moment.
Well, I mean, I feel like it's possible, especially if you're showing up and living present in the moment, that every moment can feel like that. You know? I think of the worst moments in my life, right? If I was present, when I look back, I'm grateful for the experience because of what, you know, that's what I loved about football is there's certain things you can only get to when things are a level of intensity because they're buried so deep.
Yep.
But if you're able to go to that level of intensity, you got access to stuff.
The key is I'm starting to learn is that I can get to that place without always having to manufacture that adversity and or, you know, be in such an intense environment where like I have to be present or I have to drive that focus.
But at the same time, I think, you know, moving into entrepreneurship, that's like it's like an intentional, conscious stepping into that intensity. And I think the training for that intensity is because, you know, a little cliche, but people talk about doing something to change the world. If you're gonna do something to make a difference in the world, you better bring some intensity because the structures of the world are so fixed. If we don't bring that kind of intensity, we're not gonna be able to push the needle.
Yeah, I tell people, you know, I haven't done anything more difficult than what I'm doing right now. I played 8 years in the NFL, big time college football, the whole nine. And that stuff, yes, is very challenging. Hardest thing I've ever done. But what I'm doing right now is equally as challenging in a lot of different ways. And it's like, well, how do you take those skills that allowed you to be, you know, ex-athlete and obtain X level of achievement, like how do you repurpose those?
Yeah.
And that's the journey
Yeah.
that I had to kind of take inward and saying like, look, well, it wasn't the physical act, but what allowed me to do the physical act? Because running into folks, running the ball, like that's not for everyday folks.
Yeah, it's not for everybody.
It's not for everybody, right? Especially as you go up the ladder.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, okay, I can't do that anymore, but what are the intrinsic characteristics that allowed me to do that?
A lot of times, especially in football, we're wearing a helmet and there's these stereotypes about how we're supposed to be. There's not an honoring of the inside, the part of us inside that does the work. You know, people act like it's natural born ability, and yeah, we have natural born ability. But if you can't tap into those inner resources and express that ability,
when you talk about that intensity, that's what I was looking for my next act. Like, where can my hair be lit on fire every day? Where can I bring it every day? And it was really hard for me to find that. And I think that was a contributing factor because I didn't know where it was going to be. So that's why I was dealing with some of the conditions I was dealing with out the gate.
What are some of the internal battles that you've faced, that you found, you know, in your inner journey in this process of leaving football and now becoming a CEO, starting a company? What are some of those doubts and insecurities that dragons you had to slay?
Yeah, it was really just kind of starting with the concept and the fact that I had to start over. What I realized was that it took me a long time to make it to the NFL. Like I just didn't come out the womb and make it to the NFL. And so all the work, resources, everything that it took to get me there took some time, intentionality, and a lot of things had to happen right for me. And I had to sit with that because when you are creme de la creme and then you're no longer creme de la creme, you know, you start to feel a certain type of way about yourself. And then just paired with like going into a whole new territory. Like I didn't know anything about business. I I got my MBA, and that was a good start, but it wasn't practical enough to like give me real world experience, tangible experience. Like I had never started a company before. I had never raised money. Like I never hired anybody before. Like all these things, as I mentioned, I just had to like get the gusto to figure them out.
Yeah.
And a lot of what I learned in sport is that, just surround yourself with the right people to help you.
Yeah.
And that was the biggest lesson. Like we've always had a coach.
Yeah.
So why would I keep living life without a coach? I've always had a coach, and I've had some legendary coaches. And so like now that I'm not in sport, who are my coaches? Who's helping me with my money? Who's helping me with my business? Who's helping me with my family, right? Like where are those voices, where are those coaches at now? And that's what I was saying earlier, like we don't have to, a lot of times we feel like we have to do it by ourselves. And I was guilty of that for a very long time. Prideful individual, like, no, I got it. I'm good. I'm not good. I'm not okay. I need help. I need support. And the last piece on it is like asking for help is the hardest thing to do. Mm. Everybody talks about like you should just ask for help. You know how hard it is to ask for help?
The stakes are high, man.
It is incredibly difficult to ask for help. It's a simple concept, but incredibly difficult to do. And I really had to start to humble myself to ask for help.
You mentioned family. And for me, I found like family has been the most like pivotal area of my mental health. Mm. When I think of family, it's where like the people who I let my guard all the way down. They have more access to my heart, and so they have more like input on what my mental health is like. So, how has family like played into your journey?
I come from a 2-parent home. My dad and mom were always there. My dad was there so much, like he was my coach. I didn't want my dad there. He was there so much. But they've always, always, always been there. And so when you talk about like peace, people knowing you, having that support system, like that was embedded into me day one. And so now the bar and the standard, at least for me personally, is really high with my own family, right? I have a wife, 2 young daughters. And so I think about that a lot, and I try to reflect the positive traits, particularly of like the community support that I had from an upbringing standpoint. Like I now have to exhibit that in my own family. As a child, you don't understand the full picture.
Yeah.
And I think, man, my dad was probably going through some shit.
Yeah.
Right? And it was back then. Like, how were you navigating like the challenges of being a Black man, a father, a husband, all these things? Like, how were you dealing with it back then? It's the same setup. Like, when I told, like, how were you dealing with it back then? So now I'm at that life stage where my father was at back when I was 7.
Yeah.
Probably dealing with the same things.
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, this shit is heavy. Like, Dad, how are you doing? Like, if you didn't have any of these resources.
Does he talk with you about that?
Not really. I want to get better at that, though. I definitely want to get better at that. It's interesting, just kind of running this company. A lot of people think that, it should be one way in all of your relationships and like how you interact with people, but it's not like that.
Like I would say the right way.
Yeah, the right way, right?
Yeah.
And so like even just bridging those conversations, like my parents are well aware of the work that I do, and they're extremely proud and thankful. But we all have like, I think, traumas that we need to kind of like unpack and talk through. And, there's been some things that recently have happened within my family that have, I think left some pretty significant scars. And, just I'm still trying to find the right language to kind of talk about that amongst my family too.
Yeah. I feel like family and it's a completely taboo subject in the NFL is relationships. Mm. I think of family, I think of the family I grew up in, but now when I think of family, I think of my wife and my kids. And for me, like the greatest blessing in my life is my wife. But there's been other relationships in the past where it was like not the greatest blessing, and like the work that I've done in my partnership, because you can hide stuff about yourself from people out there. But if you live with someone,
they know you.
Yeah, you can't hide, and it forces you, especially if you care about the person, it forces you to deal with deal with your stuff. And one of my mentors says, that talking about spiritual work, he says the greatest spiritual work you could do is trying to live with another person, trying to live with and honor another person.
I've been married, it'll be 11 years next month.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
Especially in the league,
Yeah, it was, man, I got married and we had our first daughter and I was 27 years old. That was my last year in Pittsburgh, 2012. But I've been very blessed and thankful to have a wife who gives me the space that I need to figure things out. Particularly during that time, I'm sure it was terrible being married to me. I'm naturally sometimes very moody, closed off, short, the whole nine. But my wife has been there every step of the way, just kind of being whatever's needed in the moment. And I think that's the great thing about partnership is that, you don't have to be perfect, but the key to it is being what's needed in the moment and making sure that you're growing together and not growing apart.
Yeah, I always say, if you don't grow together, you will grow apart.
You will, absolutely. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say that I'm the same Ryan Mundy that I was when we first met or when we got married almost 11 years ago. I am not.
Yeah.
She is not the same either, right? And so our, I guess, challenge or our opportunity is to grow together.
Yeah. I think it's something that at least among athletes, no one ever talks about.
The relationship
the
side
relationship
of
side of it, just how important it is.
What do you think about because I mentioned some of those stats around when guys retire, the absurdly high rates of divorce, particularly with relationships. Where do you think that comes from?
We make decisions in life when we're young based off limited knowledge of ourselves. And especially when you make a decision when you your future is related to being a football player. And then when that future ends, we have to evolve really quickly. And I think it's a lot to ask the partner to evolve as quickly too, and to grow out of that experience, because they're not as intimately involved with it as we are. And so we have to grow really quickly. And if we haven't chosen a partner that can grow with us, then it becomes a challenge. I think Tom Brady and Giselle are a great example. And just hearing what both of them are saying about the experience is they realize that they grew apart. That who they were when they met, it's not who they are anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I always kind of looked at it and I said, you're at home for the first time, right? You're not at training camp, you're not at practice all day. Here's an example, on one of my teams, you got pool tables and ping pong and stuff like that in the locker room. And we would end practice and sometimes you have a post-practice meeting, whatever. But after that post-practice meeting, this is when I'm young, saying, man, I'm trying to get the heck out of the building. I'm gone, right? See y'all tomorrow. But I noticed the older guys, they would just always hang around.
Yeah.
Playing cards, playing pool, whatever it is. And I just asked him, I was like, man, why are y'all just hanging around here? He's like, hey man, I ain't trying to leave work to go back to work.
Yeah.
I was like, oh.
Man.
Yeah, interesting. And so when you remove the first part of your work, right, being at the building facility all day, and then now you're just there, that is unfamiliar territory for, I think, a lot of our peers. And that in and of itself can be a very, very strong catalyst to some of the stats and things that we see.
Yeah, and there is so many elements to relationships like that, the homeostasis is all built around this divide and conquer mentality of I'm at home, you're here, and can we really do this thing of coming together? We don't really know until that moment comes.
So I'm sure you see this a lot with the powerful dynamic relationships. I feel when I was playing and things were good at home, right? I was balling. You know, things not so good at home, like, weighed on me.
I think, again, we talked about compartmentalization. I think athletes have, for a long time, been taught that they can compartmentalize. And I think that what we're learning
That's
now.
a good thing.
We have to.
Like,
It's
you
like
have to.
Yeah.
But I think even when you got, and there is, like the compartmentalization is probably dissociation, right? Like being able to dissociate, like a healthy dissociation. However, the notion that there's this ability for the body, which is the hard drive, to all of a sudden just not have that stress and tension from off the field and just not be able to have, or not to have that impact any ability to go access flow state or access the joy or the intuition of that's necessary to be good at sport. I think that's a myth too, right? Like I think that there is compartmentalization and dissociation, but I think that the body keeps the score.
Yeah.
And that it makes sense that you would say that you played better when things were going better at home.
It's one thing to dissociate and put it away, but if you don't have the tools to address it when it's time to address it, like, you know you got issues, but if you don't know what to do about the issues, like,
Well, and you both have tools and elixirs that you
got
could.
Alchemy.
Yeah, the Alchemy, right? Tools and elixirs that you're bringing back. If both of you walked right now into NFL locker room now and they gave you an hour, what kind of tools are you trying to distribute back to those football players?
I just always just try to connect and say, like, look, man, I've been there. And wherever you are, I've been. Wherever you're headed, I've probably been there, right? So I'm always trying to get here with our peers, because I just believe from experience, not many people can get there, right? Like, everybody wants some from, like, all this stuff that kind of comes with it. At times, you just don't feel like you can just be, right? And so I try to establish that rapport, and then just, again, making myself available. Like, there's a lot of our NFL brethren out there that need help and support. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, although we're in a better state for the conversation, I just vividly remember, like, I didn't even like going in the training room sometimes, because I didn't want them to see me getting ice on my ankle or getting like, hey, you good? You all right? You know, so let alone like some mental or emotional stuff. I didn't even want them to don't let them see, putting ice on my knee or whatever it is. But now we're talking like the mental body, which is like unknown territory. And so I know a lot of guys need an outlet and a voice and a champion. And I just try to let them know that I see you and I will always be a champion.
I go back to the idea that our mind really is the most powerful tool. And I think when I talk to guys, I try to, like, prove it to them, Is the mind could be your best friend, or it could be your worst enemy. And I think to prioritize, I call it like taking your thoughts to the cleaners. That's why I think about being present. It's because when you're present, you're letting go of thoughts that bring you out of the present. And after you do that long enough, the thoughts that bring you out of the present, they start to disappear.
Yeah.
And then what starts to show up in its place are the thoughts about creating the future.
Possibilities, yeah. I know Ricky and I have talked about this. Extremely passionate about this idea that access is, into mental health experiences, tools, all those things are going to be what truly changes and transforms a lot of this society in this world. And personally for me, I believe that because it's such a basic need that we've always had, but especially it's exposing itself now, that it's a human right. From your perspective, how do we push this conversation away from this being this, subtopic mental health and put it in this frame of a basic human need?
Think about just like the healthcare system as a whole, everything is reactive. There's not a lot of emphasis on proactive care, right? Like, how do we just keep you from not going to the emergency room? Or how do we keep you away from all these things? Or how do we keep you away from skyrocketing drug costs? That's what all the money is on, like, care and drugs for conditions that already exist. But like, how about we just make healthier people and we ain't gotta worry about none of that?
I love that.
Yeah.
Any final elixirs to offer before we step off this soul training?
And I told you backstage, man, I wanted to come here and first and foremost say thank you. I understand now the gravity and the power and just like what it took to kind of be vulnerable and show up the way that you showed up way back when, 15 or so years ago. And as we talked about, like now we're on set talking about it, right? And that's how far things have come. But way back then, it was right in front of our face, and we didn't necessarily respond to it in the right way. I vividly remember that time, and there was just such a negative connotation and a negative presentation about everything that you were going through, talking about what is this guy talk, all that stuff. And then now to look back and see what the current state is for our country, our community, our world, it's on everybody's radar. There's definitely kudos and just thanks and gratitude for you showing up the way that you showed up a long time ago.
Thank you. I mean, for me, it was, what I loved about sports, football was courage.
Yeah.
It's like, we get the schedule, I started looking at the schedule, who we got, oh man, But you got to show up.
Yeah.
And so it forces you to deal with it and still bring your best every day. And when I started prioritizing taking care of myself, I needed that same kind of dedication and that same kind of courage to do it.
No, I appreciate y'all opening up the platform. This is a really, really important topic of conversation, obviously, and I appreciate you guys for holding space and opening up the platform.
Yeah, this was great. It's the conversation. I feel like the greatest gift you can give to someone is say something that no one else will say. And I feel like we put words to some things today.